Hey viewers, today I have another horror movie that even scares me. It is a 2020 Spanish horror film. The release of this film coincides with the global COVID-19 pandemic. Reportedly, the actress playing Dr. Carol dreams of a fly crawling into her ear the night before filming the driving scene. The next day during filming, a real fly repeatedly flies into her car on set. Let's dive into the story. Eric always has trouble sleeping at night. His parents find Dr. Carol for him. The doctor thinks it is just a problem with the new house, but Eric immediately denies it. He says he hears strange noises at night. Those noises force him to draw. The doctor has no other options and advises Daniel and his wife Sarah to move away. While they speak, a fly flies out of the pipe. After the doctor leaves, the strange noise appears again. Eric picks up the walkie-talkie to listen. Meanwhile, as the doctor drives, a fly enters her car and crawls into her ear, and she cannot remove it. Just then, something strange happens. The woman slams on the gas pedal as her eyes slowly turn red. The vehicle speeds out of control. Ultimately, the woman is fatally injured. The fly also crawls out of her ear. Eerily, Eric seems to predict the future and has already drawn her death. This is foreshadowing viewers. Meanwhile, as Daniel works, he finds a spot covered in flies. He assumes it is just a hygiene issue and grabs bug spray to kill them. This is also foreshadowing viewers. Shortly after, Eric calls his father on the walkie-talkie. His rubber ball falls into the pool. His father repeatedly warns him not to go to the pool alone. Eric always obeys this rule. A moment later, while taking a bath, Eric asks his mother a strange question. He feels Daniel hates him and claims his father says hateful things on the walkie-talkie. His mother quickly comforts him and says his dad loves him very much and would never say such things. That night, Daniel watches a show about psychophony. Sarah comes over and asks if he yells at Eric. Daniel says he never does. He thinks Eric just needs more attention. Late at night, the noise wakes Eric up again. Just as he picks up the walkie-talkie, a toy suddenly moves on its own. He walks over to pick up the toy, but as soon as he looks down, he sees a pair of feet. He looks up and sees someone standing behind the curtain. And that strange noise grew louder and louder. Eric was terrified, diving straight under the covers and covering his ears tightly with his hands. Just then, the sound suddenly disappeared. Hearing no more movement, Eric slowly lowered his hands. Suddenly, a pair of hands covered his mouth. It turned out to be his father, but Eric hadn't recovered his senses and pushed him away. Fortunately, his mother arrived in time to comfort him. Eric then calmed down, and Daniel's hand was also injured. Turned out he had pressed against the sharp corner of a photo album during the panic. The next day, his mother picked Eric up from school. Only then did Daniel find out the child had been expelled. The reason was Eric refused to attend class, skipping and hiding in a small room. He skipped class, hid in a small room, and even bit the teacher. His mother was furious and told Eric that she would have the doctor come over every day from now on. But Eric said that those voices told him the doctor was already dead. The couple felt something was wrong and called the teacher to verify. Exactly as Eric had said, Dr. Carol had died. Not long after, Daniel had a heart-to-heart talk with his son. Eric said he didn't like it here and begged his dad to move them away. But his father said they would sell the house after it was renovated so it could fetch a good price. That night, Sarah heard the iron pool gate rattling again. So Daniel was sent to see what was going on. After going downstairs, Daniel felt something was wrong. The iron gate kept swinging back and forth, as if someone were deliberately messing with them. Without a word, Daniel grabbed a weapon and went outside. Sarah also felt something was wrong and went to Eric's room, only to find that the child was not in the room at all. Meanwhile, just as Daniel reached the door, he saw Eric's clothes. He picked up the clothes and called out Eric's name, but there was no response from his surroundings. He suddenly thought of something and turned around to sprint wildly towards the pool. When he rushed to the pool, he saw Eric's body. By the time he was pulled out, the child was already unresponsive. The couple held their child, breaking down and crying in despair. The next day, after finishing Eric's funeral, the couple returned home devastated. The mother couldn't accept reality and prepared to leave. Just as she finished packing her luggage, she noticed a drop of blood on Daniel's pillow. She reached out to touch it. The blood stain had long since dried. Just then, Daniel walked in. He didn't want to leave and still wanted to finish renovating the house because they were now completely penniless. After saying this, Sarah left. This blood stain is a huge foreshadowing, viewers. You will understand when you watch until the end. At night, Daniel sat alone in the living room, watching videos of Eric from when he was alive. Then Daniel sends an apology voice message to his wife on his phone and turns off the TV to get ready for bed. Right then, Daniel hears a strange noise. He turns around and sees no one behind him. Just as he gets up to check, the TV suddenly turns on by itself. He walks over and turns off the TV. But as soon as he turns it off, the strange noise appears again. Daniel follows the sound and discovers it comes from the walkie-talkie. He picks up the walkie-talkie and calls out. But there is no response from the walkie-talkie. When Daniel turns to leave, the strange noise rings out again. The next day, Daniel is woken up by a phone call from his wife. His wife says she did not understand a single word of the voice message he sent yesterday. It only contains bizarre static and piercing screams. Daniel thinks it is a bad signal, so he hangs up the phone and listens to it again. The voice message is exactly as his wife described. Then Daniel listens to it repeatedly on his computer. This time, he actually hears Eric's cry for help. This startles Daniel into a cold sweat, and he instantly realizes that his son's death is absolutely not that simple. Not long after, Daniel finds German, who studies psychophony on television, and plays the recording for him. After listening, German instantly becomes interested. Soon, German sets off with his daughter Ruth. But Ruth thinks Daniel's recording is faked. German retorts how a father could fake his dead son's voice. After they arrive, Daniel and German start chatting by the pool. German is confused about how someone could drown since the water is not deep at all. Daniel says the civil guard's preliminary police theory deduces it happened when Eric picked up the ball. But Daniel knows Eric can swim and does not believe this theory at all. That is why he invited German over. Meanwhile, Ruth is adjusting the equipment, completely unaware that an apparition is standing right behind her. Not long after, Daniel finds Ruth and asks her what these devices are for. Ruth says these are recording devices that can capture sounds ordinary people cannot hear. With everything ready, the group officially begins. Ruth sits in front of the computer to observe the footage. German holds the audio receiver to look for suspicious sound sources in the house. After turning on the thermal imaging, Ruth discovers a figure sitting in Eric's room. She thinks Daniel is inside and asks her father to get him out. German is completely dumbfounded when he hears this, because Daniel is not in the room at all and has been sitting outside the whole time. Ruth quickly turns off the thermal imaging after hearing this, but as soon as she turns it off, the figure disappears. She finds it unbelievable and tries again. The result is exactly the same. Seeing this, German walks to the stairs, and just as he expects, the higher he goes, the stronger the sound signal becomes. After saying this, German heads upstairs. German goes up to the second floor and heads straight for Eric's room to ask Ruth if she can still see the figure. But the signal suddenly worsens. Ruth cannot hear what he is saying at all. German has no choice but to bite the bullet and keep moving forward. When German walks to the head of the bed, the signal suddenly restores. But Ruth says the figure is standing right in front of him. German is completely dumbfounded because there is nothing in front of him. Suddenly, a strange noise comes from German's headphones. Because the sound is too quiet, he turns up the volume. Just as he listens carefully, the sound suddenly becomes incredibly piercing and almost deafens German. Now they have no choice but to pause the investigation for now. Afterward, everyone watches the footage, full of doubts. Who exactly is this figure? In the end, they have to admit that this is a supernatural phenomenon and that the figure is an apparition. German decides on the spot to try again the next day. When they rest at night, something strange happens again. German is awakened by a nightmare, but as soon as he lies down, he hears someone calling his name. He follows the sound and actually sees his wife, who died years ago, cooking. German cannot believe everything in front of him, but this feeling is too real. As they talk, the woman suddenly takes out a knife and slashes at German's wrist. German can feel the pain, but his body cannot move, and he can only watch helplessly. At the critical moment, Ruth arrives in time and wakes him up. German recovers his senses, and the wife in front of him disappears. And that knife is held in his own hand. German is completely confused, but fortunately the wound is not deep and not life-threatening. Meanwhile, Sarah is woken up by a phone call while sleeping. She picks up the phone and actually hears Eric's voice. Eric begs his mother for help and says a man wants to harm him. This man is German, viewers. He also tells his mother to come quickly because he is hiding under the bed. The next day, as Ruth smokes outside, she looks up and sees the trees in the distance covered with the cat's remains. Not long after, Daniel buries all these dead cats. German has lived for a long time, but has never seen a scene like this. As the two talk, Sarah arrives. The strange thing is that she takes one look at German and walks into the house. Meanwhile, Ruth finishes buying medicine for her father and walks back. Suddenly, a village woman calls out to her and seems to know the secret of this house. Ruth becomes interested upon hearing this and immediately follows the woman over. Sarah also walks into Eric's room and takes a look, but Eric is not under the bed at all. Just as she prepares to leave, Eric suddenly appears in front of her. Sarah is extremely thrilled and cannot believe everything in front of her. Just as she reaches out to touch Eric, he crawls under the bed. Right after that, the bizarre fly flies out again. Just as Sarah bends down to look under the bed, a pair of strange legs appears on the opposite side and slowly climbs onto the bed. But when Sarah stands up, the bed is completely empty with nothing there. Just as Sarah looks under the bed again, Eric suddenly jumps out from the side. Sarah backs away in terror, and as she backs up, her hand suddenly touches a pair of cold feet. Immediately after, a hand suddenly reaches out and tightly covers her mouth. On the other side, German makes a new discovery. He says these dead cats are a warning from the witch because they trespass into her territory. Just then, Ruth pushes the door open and walks in. Ruth says 300 years ago this place was an Inquisition tribunal. More than 10 women lost their lives here. But before she could finish speaking, Sarah's body suddenly fell from the ceiling. Daniel frantically rushed over to save her, but his wife had already stopped breathing. That bizarre fly crawled out of Sarah's ear again. It wasn't long before the civil guard arrived. But Daniel sat there like he had lost his soul, not saying a single word. After the civil guard left, Herman made a new discovery, but Ruth told everyone to leave here immediately. Herman was very reluctant to leave, but he couldn't win the argument against his daughter. Meanwhile, Daniel was spacing out in Eric's room when he suddenly saw Sarah standing there holding Eric. He quickly walked over to check, but upon lifting the curtain, the two of them inside had vanished into thin air. Suddenly, a monster rushed towards him. Daniel was on the verge of being driven mad by the torment. Ruth, who was packing up the equipment, noticed the computer screen turn on by itself. On it was footage of Sarah sitting on the edge of the bed. She hurriedly called Herman over. The two watched as Sarah in the footage opened the balcony door, was compelled to heed death, and then without hesitation was driven to a fatal fall. Just as the two watched in horror, a gunshot rang out from upstairs. They immediately thought of Daniel, and after rushing upstairs, they see Daniel looking like a madman, pointing a gun at them. After some comforting from German, Daniel finally slowly calms down. Looking at Daniel's pitiful state, the father and daughter decide not to leave and want to help Daniel investigate this matter to the end. Then German tells Daniel that to end all this, they must find the ruins of the Inquisition tribunal from back then. German suspects the Inquisition tribunal is right under the house, but they just never found the entrance. Hearing this, Daniel instantly realizes where the entrance is. Sure enough, it is the place that spawned flies earlier. Daniel smashes open the wall and discovers a staircase leading down inside. The group immediately walks down. After going down, they discover it is filled with all kinds of ancient torture devices. When the group reaches the deepest part, German accidentally sees an iron cage with a skeleton inside. The skeleton's mouth is opened extremely wide, making it look like she suffered Inquisition torture before death. German gathers his courage and touches the cage, causing images of this woman before her death to instantly flood his mind. Through voice comparison, German confirms that the strange noise from before was made by this woman. German also says, she is the witch who was unjustly killed, and they must burn her remains. Then the group goes to the storage room to find gasoline. But there is too little gasoline to be of any use. Daniel tells German to go down first, while he stays behind to keep looking. Then German finds Ruth and tells her to guard the door while he goes down alone. Not long after German goes down, his flashlight flickers on and off. He smacks it, and suddenly 2 figures appear in front of him. One of them is the witch from back then. The Inquisitor takes out the Pier of Anguish and uses the device to silence her. Ultimately, the woman dies during the torture. This is the truth behind the witch's tragic death, which fills her with extreme resentment. Meanwhile, seeing her father has not come up for a long time, Ruth calls out his name into the tunnel. But a woman's figure flashes behind her. Ruth instantly notices it. Just as she leans forward to investigate, Ruth's deceased mother suddenly appears and tells her to come over. Ruth sees through it at a glance that this is not her mother at all. Seeing her disguise is exposed, the woman walks towards Ruth but disappears as she approaches. Just as Ruth turns around, the witch suddenly appears right in her face. Ruth is terrified and pulls out a pocket knife to defend herself. Just then, the witch suddenly appears behind Ruth. The witch gets closer and closer to her. Meanwhile, Daniel sees his son's rubber ball roll over. He walks over and sees the witch standing motionless in front of him. Suddenly, the witch screams in his ear. Daniel turns around and sees his dead wife and son. Sarah tells Daniel to stop German because if the witch is gone, the apparitions would disappear. Daniel does not say a word and just reaches out to hug the mother and son in front of him. But viewers can clearly see that the person Daniel holds in his arms is actually the witch. Meanwhile, German pours gasoline on the skeleton from a jerry can. Suddenly, an eerie singing voice comes from behind him. Just as he turns around to check, Ruth suddenly appears behind him. German is completely unaware. He turns back and continues to pour gasoline. Ruth suddenly rushes up and viciously stabs German. Ruth's eyes are completely red, and she is obviously controlled by the witch. German desperately tries to wake Ruth up, but it is completely useless. At the critical moment, German picks up his gun. Meanwhile, Daniel prepares to harm himself. He holds a lighter and prepares to ignite it. Fortunately, German thinks fast and shoots Ruth to knock her out and immediately ignites the remains. Instantly, a raging fire burns on the skeleton. Daniel and Ruth also regain their sanity. That bizarre fly also flies out of Ruth's ear. Seeing her father injured, Ruth quickly helps him up to bandage the wound. Fortunately, it is treated in time, and German is not in life-threatening danger. The final revelation is here, viewers. Daniel returns to Eric's room and accidentally finds the drawings the child made before he died. He discovers that the contents of Eric's drawings are all things that actually happened later, and they were all drawn before the incidents happened. We mentioned this at the beginning. These drawings were all drawn by Eric, under the witch's control. But when Daniel sees the last drawing, he completely breaks down. It turns out the witch had used that fly to control Daniel's mind long ago. The night of his son's accident, the person responsible was Daniel himself. It is just that he was controlled and completely does not remember. It was him who took Eric to the pool and caused Eric to drown until the child stopped breathing. After doing all this, he quietly returned to bed while blood flowed from his ear. The blood stain on the pillow his wife finds earlier is the ironclad proof that Daniel is controlled. Daniel cannot accept this truth, so he takes the shotgun to the pool and dies by suicide. But even until his death, Daniel does not know that even his suicide is already drawn in Eric's pictures. At the end of the story, Ruth hears the gunshot and rushes over, but it is already too late. Only Daniel's lifeless body remains in the pool. See you next time.